Welcome everyone to our March 2025 online talk for Castle Studies group members. I'm delighted to be joined by Neal Green, who'll be talking about Berkhamsted Castle. So it's an interesting topic which Neil approached me about a few months ago now, and the timing was exceptionally good as the speaker initially planned for this month wasn't able to join us. So I hope to be rearranging that one, but Neil's timing is absolutely impeccable. I'm very excited to hear more about Berkhamsted. Doesn't quite count as my local castle, but it's certainly one of the closest ones to me at the moment. Neil, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Um, okay, so here we go. Just sort of a bit of background to why is an amateur member of the group who's not officially connected to the Berkhamsted Castle Trust presenting about Berkhamsted Castle. Um, I grew up in Sheffield. As we saw recently, Sheffield Castle was hugely disappointing until much more recently. Certainly through the 1970s, it was not great. I moved to Berkhamsted as a teenager and suddenly had a castle to actually look at and play with and visit and try and work out what was going on. Um, but was very much reliant on kind of the understanding of castles at the time, um, and lived happily in the knowledge that they lived in the keep, and the large rectangular building on the west side of the Bailey was a chapel. Um, and didn't have really much reason to question it or pull it apart. Went off to university, did a degree in archaeology, where we actually had a lecture from someone at Exeter University. But at that stage, I wasn't really ready to think of castles as complex multi-period sites. I was still kind of in the mindset of fortresses evolving towards an apogee of impregnability. Um, More recently, I've sort of come back to castles and saw some of the writings of CSG, um, Paul Renfrey's exhaustive volume on the castle, and sort of one of other people's writings, and just started to sort of kick things around and say, does that fit? Does that work? Sort of revisiting. This is no longer my local castle, sadly. I'm now in South London, but still have a very much fondness for it. Um, so that turned into a couple of articles that were written for a more general audience. And then a little while later, Neil Ludlow did a presentation here on Richard of Cornwall, and we got into a very interesting conversation about things Richard of Cornwall might have built, and a challenge from Neil to actually do these two papers properly. So I've started doing that, and just thought as a way in, let's sort of do a talk, do a presentation, and see, test on a more expert audience whether these ideas stack up. Now, I know Berkhamsted is a very familiar castle to many people, but let's do a quick recap. 1066, this is where the Saxon nobles surrendered to William. Nobody really knows if there's anything here at that time, but there must have been some reason to meet here. I just noticed looking recently at Duncan Wright and Oliver Crichton's recent paper on Saxon power centres, it ticks a few of the boxes. We have an enclosure of about an acre, we have water, we have a mill, but nothing else you could really sort of pin anything on. But everyone's sure that by about 1070, Robert of Mortain would have started building a modern Bailey castle. Domesday mentions a Fossarius, a ditch digger. 1123, the castle was held by Ranulph the Chancellor, who unfortunately died galloping uphill to meet the king, having a seizure and falling off his horse. A little bit later, we have Thomas Becket and Barons' War, Richard of Cornwall. A little bit later, we have Edward III and the Black Prince, King John of France being a prisoner here, and the Black Prince's honeymoon. And finally, in 1469, Princess Cecily of York. And these milestones probably represent the main phases of building as far as anyone can tell. There's sort of evidence of activity around this time, little evidence of activity at other times. So we'll be sort of thinking about some of that as we go. Next part of the recap, 1495, where Princess Cecily dies, the castle's abandoned. This lovely picture from 1607, probably the earliest view of the castle, is an estate plan where the castle is kind of incidental to other parts of the estate, but you can actually see the complete outworks, three much to the north, two to the south, those interesting bastions and outwork to the west as well. 1580, the castle had been largely demolished. So by the time of this survey, there are no buildings left. Little bits of the outer walls. You can just about see the gates left, and these interesting sort of stables and brew house, which we might look at again a bit more. 1837, the railway is built, destroying the Barbican. I think there's sort of an interesting subtopic on why were castles destroyed to put railways through them. We can have sort of a few examples of those. 1900s, some early archaeological investigations, mostly summarised in the Victoria County history. Then 1930s, we have some clearance by the Ministry of Works, excavations, consolidation of the fabric, lots of rebuilding, as we've seen in other sites, that it's quite difficult to work out what the men from the ministry did. And I think Paul Renfrey suggests a very early example of a Ministry of Works well-mown lawn. 2018, the Castle Trust arrive and take on the custodianship. And that's a very brief history. Berkhamsted Place there is the building that was built in the 1580s from the rubble of the castle. And that was demolished in the 1960s. So weirdly, the castle actually survived longer. So, as you may have seen, as you may be familiar, the remains as we see them now, we have what's called a textbook Motte and Bailey. Is it? It has rather more ditches than a textbook Motte and Bailey, and a lovely bank around the outside. I think Paul Renfrey has demonstrated is probably the removal of the material from the middle by the ministry men who've sort of banked it up around the edge. Impressive earthworks, triple moat, some remains of the curtain walls and turrets, some foundations of the keep, curious rectangular building which we'll come back to, and moat range next to it, the side of the southern gateway, some kitchen fireplaces, a bit of a cross wall, and a Victorian cottage which now turns out to be possibly 17th century. So lots of interest there, lots to know. I picked on the ministry plan from 1948 just because it shows that strange cross wall curving across the bailey in a rather odd way that's sort of difficult to explain. I think in the latest version that's been abandoned. They've kind of scrubbed that out, but you can still see it on air photos. Mm-hmm. So it definitely does that. It's definitely there. So there are a few kind of oddities with this plan. The very outer ditch is missing. There's a causeway and a cottage missing, obviously, but it does show these sort of whatever they found in the 1930s, which doesn't really seem to be recorded anywhere else. So we shall be looking at those in more detail. And we've got lots of documentary evidence. We've got pipe rolls, we've got monastic chroniclers, we've got surveys, but none of these people were really interested in recording the buildings as such. Pipe rolls are accounts. They're really more interested in why the king wasn't getting 100% of the money. The monastic chroniclers had important points to make about God being in control of the world, and being less than complimentary about some of the occupants of the castle and what they did. And with the surveys, these are definitely surveyors telling you the cost of what's going to need fixing. You can still almost hear the sharp intake of breath and the rubbing of chins. But it gives us some evidence. So my question, coming relatedly, if they didn't live in the keep, where did they live? Normal medieval residence would be a hall and chamber. So where are they? Several chambers are mentioned in the records. The hall is very briefly mentioned twice. So going back to the pipe rolls in the late 1150s, it mentions the king's houses, Dominus Rex, Infra Motta, and a chamber in the Bailey, a camera Infra Ballium. I've learned a lot of Latin in the process of doing this. I'm still not very good at it, but we'll keep going. And in the Victoria County history, that's translated the king's houses within the motte. And in every publication since, it's been translated the king's houses on the motte, assuming we're talking about a keep of some sort, maybe a shell keep with buildings inside it, houses of some sort. Paul Renfrey suggested that actually that word infra could mean below the motte, sort of peripheral to. So we're looking at sort of perhaps rather than on top of the motte, somewhere in the Inner Bailey. Um, so that's a thought that might be worth exploring. Also, a point to think about, in 1158, the king's houses were being repaired. They already existed in the 1150s when the earliest masonry is thought to have been started. Again, there are different accounts for that. Bringing forward to 1337, it describes the houses below the precinct of the Great Tower. So again, that word infra appears, houses below the Great Tower. So there's some evidence for something going on in the Inner Bailey. And that's where I think we should look first. So where the King's House is on the motte, our motte top is small, 29 metres across. There's not a huge amount of room for many buildings. But compared to a motte where you'd find a tower, it's quite wide. And as Neal's pointed out, quite thin walls to get to any height and stand up. We've got contradictory remains. We've got a subcircular ring wall. The masonry matches the 12th century in terms of the plinth. It's got a ground floor entrance and a four building, all of which kind of sounds a bit shell-keepy. But then it's got a central octagonal pillar with water-holding moulding, which brings us to a date firmly 1200 to 1240, before the Pope banned it, which is just a lovely fact. Remains of skew arches, remains of a mortared floor and a well shaft, later fireplace against a buttress, a lead roof, no trace of internal buildings, no trace of an inner tower. It's called a motte in the 1150s, it's called a turris from 1214 onwards. Looking at Robert Himes' book on shell keeps, that doesn't really tell you a great deal, so you can't rely on that as a guide to much. Just to see if it got me anywhere, I did try comparing all the diameters of shell keeps and other motte tops you can possibly find. First lesson, no one agrees on the internal diameter of any of these buildings. You get all sorts of different numbers. Windsor is biggest by far. Caldecott is the smallest one I got hold of. Berkhamsted sits sadly somewhere bigger than all of the towers apart from Tickhill, which has a rock foundation, so you can go bigger. Smaller than pretty much all the other shell keeps apart from Wiston, which was converted to a tower. But as has been highlighted, they had to do a lot of strengthening of the tower at Wiston to make it go up. So it's all feeling a bit inconclusive about the motte, but just kind of worth considering. So I don't think I have a shell keep, but I don't know what I do have. So looking instead in the Inner Bailey, we have these lovely foundations by the Derngate, this sort of weird rectangular building on all the plans, in fact. Some sort of small chamber, dated to the 13th century by Page and Montgomery, who did the excavations in the 1900s. Seemed to be more or less of one build with this Boston gate. But you've got this sort of void down here, which neatly aligns with some projections on the cross wall. So that void is just tantalisingly the same size as the single aisled halls that have been excavated at Launceston and Castle Barnard, as a sort of timber framed single aisle hall. So it just sort of, that's tantalising, isn't it? Could that be a timber hall where the cross wall has been built around it later? Conversely, there's also a void in the wall here where the wall sort of thins dramatically between two projections, looking like the shadow of a building, looking as if, again, the cross wall has been built round something. So could that alternatively be all similar dimensions? We don't know the full dimensions of that. It could stretch off in this direction up to any extent. But either way, you've got potential timber frame buildings predating the cross wall, so pre-mid 12th century. Possibly a range of buildings, possibly buildings that you would have to walk through in order to get to the motte, controlling the entrance to the motte. Now that to us might sound like a really weird idea. Who would build a house where you have to walk through the house to get to another building. But again, the way we think about these things now is probably not the way people thought about those things in the Middle Ages. Is it a daft idea? I'm going to share with you a few daft ideas today and just sort of see how many of them I can get away with before you say that's too daft. So I think possibly we might have been looking at a collection of timber buildings around the foot of the Mott, something a bit like Carisbrooke, where these buildings are now in stone. But at Carisbrooke, by, by the 1300s, the only way of getting to the Mott is to go through the Screens passage. I can't offer many other castles where that could be the case, but there's a lovely example in York. I don't know if you know Barley Hall, which is a wonderful medieval building, hall house, where over the course of time, the Screens passage has become a public right of way. The building fell into disuse. It was converted into a plumber's shop. When it was reinstated, they couldn't actually reclaim the Screens passage as part of the building because there's a road going through it. So they've had to come up with this wonderful arrangement with glass panels, and people can still wander through it. So again, standards of privacy we have today, slightly different. The hall is more of a public space, so maybe it's not such a daft idea. So that's where I wonder we might look for an early hall and chamber in the area of the Inner Bailey. Now looking sort of at the stone phase of the building, let's go back to the West Tower. Now, in the early 1900s, Page and Montgomery said this could be a chapel because it's aligned east-west. And in the way of the legend becoming a fact, could be a chapel became is a chapel, and is a chapel is firmly embedded in the mindset of many people who love Berkhamsted Castle. It does tick the box for being aligned east-west, but it's got rather a lot of doorways. That's kind of where you get in now. But at first floor level, there's a series of doorways around this end. And the ones at these end are providing access to later chambers. You can't get to the chambers any other way. So it's beginning to feel like a hub of activity rather than a prayerful retreat. Doesn't quite match the description for the Great Chapel, which is in the 1327 survey, where that had a separate chancel where the roof needed repairing. It kind of looks like a 2 or 3 story building with a basement. It's just not feeling like a chapel. Even though people love the idea that it is. So if it's not a chapel, if it could be something else, what could it be? Could it be a hall? Could it be a chamber? Let's have a look. As a hall, it's a tad on the small side for a masonry hall, although to be fair, it's the same size as the timber hall that I'm postulating in the Inner Bailey. It projects awkwardly through the curtain wall. It's got doorways not in the right places for a Screens passage. And with one end sticking out of the Bailey, you would struggle to fit in services and a great chamber around it. You could possibly have one or the other, but it doesn't really fit as a hall. Conversely, if it's a chamber, you're sort of in the range of the size you'd expect. The orientation would work better. It's got these pilaster buttresses on some of the corners, which look 12th century, and some diagonal tooling on one corner, although it's been heavily restored. It certainly feels peripheral to or below infra the Bailey. Does that match Thomas Beckett's chamber? Maybe it could be. So that's something that could be the case. So we might be looking at a great chamber here. So if that's the chamber, where's the hall? Again, looking at the plan, we have this lovely void to the south of it. There's a space here. This is the plan from 1906, Duncan Montgomery's plan, sort of post-excavation. It's similar to the plan in the Victoria County history. What he's done is superimposed his plan on the Ordnance Survey. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's some sort of doorway here, connecting doorway. Down here, in the 1900s, they noted sort of 2 parallel walls, not really going anywhere. It feels like the right place for a Screens passage. It would fit. Just here, I'll come back to this, there's the springing for a vault. There's sort of a little arch, which I'll show you a picture of in there, just kind of jutting out from the wall. Now, Montgomery and Page insisted that that lump of masonry was the end of the curtain wall because it lines up nicely with the curtain wall here. But there are a few problems with that. Firstly, if you look on the Ordnance Survey map, there is definitely some wall on a bank just here, a couple of meters to the west. But here you've got an absolutely blank space. It's completely flat. It was the garden of the cottage, which is shown on this plan. So sort of not much happening here for a few hundred years apart from gardening. Looking at this plan, which I've kindly borrowed from Paul Renfrey, who sends his cards. Um, when the curtain wall was excavated by this turret down here, they found that the curtain wall is built on top of a rectangular clay bank, which is definitely not here, but sort of looks like it is here. You've got this kind of line. So the curtain wall seems to be hitting the corner of the tower, or an outer wall is hitting the corner of the tower. Again, sort of suggesting a rectangular space. It's nice and hall shaped. And on our stub of masonry here, it's fair faced underneath. Not the sort of thing you'd really put in a foundation arch. So I was originally thinking about the first floor hall added later to a chamber with a cross passage, and it's all looking sort of fairly hunky dory. Then Neil asked me a really awkward question. If that's a 12th century chamber, where's the 12th century hall? I said, well, according to the pipe roll, there wasn't one. But would you build a chamber with no hall? Which is a very good question. So I went back and said, and this springing of the vault really looks contemporary with the wall it's in. You can't see the join. Any join like that would be really messy because this is coming straight out from the wall. There's no space to make a butt joint, which is pretty much all you can do in flint rubble. So now we're looking at possibly a 12th century first floor hall and chamber. So is that the second unbelievable thing I'm asking to consider today? And I've stumbled into an interesting debate here about did first floor halls ever exist? I missed this because this sort of happened in between my university course where Margaret Wood was still the go-to source and first floor halls were a thing. Mr. John Blair in the 90s saying, no, they never existed, they were all chambers. And now, conveniently, Nick Hill and Mark Gardner have come along and said, yeah, you really get first floor halls. And we do have at least a couple of examples where there is a normal first floor hall with a chamber attached. So it is a thing. I don't know for a fact it was a thing in Berkhamsted, but the evidence is starting to point that way. These two are quite lovely. In the case of Helmsley, obviously the hall's been gutted and turned into a two-dimension, but the original fabric is still there with a nice Norman doorway down here. So with our hall and chamber, we have an extension into the moat. They've built a moat range on. You can see that lovely coining there with some of the diagonal tooling on it. But this sort of 13th century extension. Montgomery and Page, I think it was 13th century. No one else has sort of dated differently. There's another of these sort of tile-back fireplaces in this corner, which can suggest it's 15th century. And beyond here, which you can't see, is visible on the plan, 14th century extension. Something happened in mid 14th century during the time of the Black Prince, and King John of France being a prisoner here. One or the other might be a good date for that. Who knows? Later on, it was filled with kitchen waste and 15th century tiles. That was sort of the back full of rubbish. So Neil suggested that it could possibly be a privy kitchen. Unknown, but it's thought. There's not really much sign of what I think for a privy kitchen you'd need a pretty decent range of some sort, and there's if there was one, it's not survived. So may have been sort of later change of use, or may have just been kind of post demolition backfill. Unsure. On this face of the tower higher up, you've got that lovely ambry, that sort of cupboard. Was that some sort of chapel? Was it just like a strong room where you needed a wall safe? Again, up for grabs. In one of the earliest slides I showed you, there's sort of a 17th, 18th century drawing of that, where that cupboard appears to have some like kind of two portions to it, which have been later removed. So putting it all together, sort of first off, and you have what could conveniently fit as a great chamber, something that kind of just looks hall shaped. The wall joins here, and the evidence is like that. Later extensions here, it would be a nice extension of a domestic range. That's all looking hunky dory until I was going to just put in a slide showing the parch mark and the of the cross wall going across the bailey when I spotted another sort of strange parch mark here. Let's see if we can find that for you. So let's go full screen with this. All right, bear with me. Hoping to go full screen, but now won't let me. So we were here. You can see that nice curving parch mark of the cross wall. Over here, by the rectangular tower, there's another parch mark of something, another building on the end of it. So again, there's something there. It could be kind of in the right place for maybe a chapel attached or something. Totally in the wrong place for a latrine because it's in the middle of your bailey. So much more to look at, other things to consider, other possibilities. So just sort of wrapping up. There's definitely evidence for a hall and chamber. In fact, there's evidence for two sets of halls and chamber. So duplicate accommodation, which possibly an interesting topic. Certainly from the 12th century to the 14th century, it's still there in that 1337 survey. Which begs the question, why? Did Thomas Becket need his own space? He was starting to fall out with King Henry, his former best mate. Or was it just that the accommodation was due for an upgrade? And given the process of building masonry, which is going to take you a couple of seasons, because basically you've got to pour a load of flint, rubble, and mortar into a mold, wait for it to set, do that again, face it all off. Probably looking at a couple of years process. You need somewhere to sleep in the meantime. So rather than demolish the hall you've got, you build a new one next to it. So kind of this idea of alternate development, which we see in vernacular houses, maybe it's happening in castles as well. King's houses seem to have diminished in importance and preference, certainly after the siege of 1216. Everything we said about the Inner Bailey Wall suggests it's kind of a division of function or status rather than defence. It's kind of got two nice square towers on it, or the things of those, but nothing other than kind of it rolling round to a space where you kind of walk through the halls to get to the Inner Bailey. Possibly it was later extended. There's that sort of weird left-hand kink where it sort of heads away, perhaps enclosing a garden around the well. That's another story. Keep and Moat Range still seem to be in use at the end of the castle's life. They've both got these sort of later fireplaces in. And then there are these tantalising geophys results, which I still haven't managed to get hold of. Only seem to be available by personal visit, which I might manage this summer. There's still more to find out. The only tantalising glimpse was in their annual accounts where they said there's something by the cottage and there's something to the north of the west tower. So it would be good to find out more. That's as far as I've got. We're sort of hoping to write this up, but just kind of I would be delighted to get everyone's thoughts on that. Really, over to you. Really, please ask away, and yeah, suggestions welcome.